Hello, I'm Chance McGinnis, a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for being with us. The Dole Student Advisory Board is composed of KU students committed to the bipartisan mission of the Dole Institute. Members of the SAB receive opportunities to network with guests and preference when applying for our internship assistance or for paid student positions at the Institute. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact us. The Dole Institute would like to hear from you. If you enjoy this evening's program, please let us know by contacting us on Facebook, Twitter, or through our website email. Our past and future programs are available to watch on video on our website. We'd like to encourage each of you to consider becoming friends of the Dole Institute. Do so by returning the brochure on your chair at the end of tonight's program. Our friends help keep our programs free and open and support archive research and our student activities. I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. After the interview, we will have time for questions and answers. If you have a question, raise your hand and a student helper will come to you. Please ask just one brief question. Hearing assistance is available, and we have a loop section at each program designated by a sign. If you have any questions about the loop, or if at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members or student volunteers here in the hall, and they can assist you. And now, please welcome Associate Director, Dr. Barbara Ballard.
Good evening, and thank you very much, Chance. I think you all know that we have students do our welcome every evening, and so we're very pleased when we do our program to have that. I will say welcome this evening to our program on We Can Fix It, a bipartisan blueprint to strengthen our democracy. I also would just like to mention at this time our sponsors, because our co-sponsors, and we're very pleased. And I would like to ask Jordan Lapierre from the Bipartisan Policy Center in DC to stand, please.
No, he's here.
We welcome you, and we thank you for your co-sponsorship. Also, our co-sponsors this evening are the KU Student Legislative Awareness Board, known on campus as SLAP, the Young Democrats, College Republicans, and Young Americans for Liberty. I would like to just draw your attention to the programs on the back, and I'll do so quickly so that you'll know our upcoming programs, our center stage, Kansas elections 2014 on Sunday. As you know, Kansas is the state to watch in the state. If you don't know it, you should know by now that everybody is coming here, but also they're all watching what we're doing in the state of Kansas, the first time ever in the history. We also have Women Running for Office. It's a program that I think you will find really exciting, and basically it's really focusing on women that is running on the local level as well as nationally. We know we have 99 women out of 535 that serve in the federal government, and we think maybe we should have more women and look at them, and we want people to draw attention to what women can do, especially since women have voted the most in presidential elections since 1980. Also, you'll notice that the program, The Siege of Budapest, a decisive battle against Nazism. So we hope you will take time with that. And if you haven't attended our study groups, I want you to know we are averaging almost 50 people every study session, one of the longest we've ever had, with Dave Helling from Kansas City. Now I would just say about our guest. We are very honored this evening to have the visitors that we have this evening with us to talk about bipartisan blueprint. We talk a lot about bipartisan. The Dole Institute is bipartisan, and whether or not that strengthens our democracy. Our guest this evening, Robert F. Bennett, chairman of the Bennett Group in DC. Robert Bennett's first serious political experience was in 1962, when he managed the successful re-election campaign for his father, Wallace Bennett. 30 years later, in 1992, he followed his father's footsteps with a successful campaign for himself, which took him to the U.S. Senate for 18 years. While there, he was highly regarded as a pragmatic problem solver and established himself as a powerful consensus builder among his constituents and colleagues, one of whom praised him as the smartest man in the Senate. He served on the Senate Appropriations Committee, the Banking Committee, the Natural Resources Committee, and chaired the Distinguished Joint Economic Committee, where he was at the center of national economic policy discussions. He also served as a ranking Republican on the Senate Rules Committee and as a counsel to Senate Leader Mitch McConnell. He's a highly successful entrepreneur. Prior to his Senate career, he served as the CEO of Franklin Quest Incorporated, NYSE, which he joined when the firm had only 4 full-time employees. The business grew to more than 1,000 prior to its listing on the New York Stock Exchange. For his work at Franklin, he was named Executive of the Year for the Rocky Mountain region by INC magazine. He has originally been praised by 2 qualities. And there were comments made when we talk about bipartisan. That is why I'm bringing it up this evening. Former President Bill Clinton described him as a highly intelligent, old-fashioned conservative, while Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid said there is no more honorable member of this body than Bob Bennett. Senator Mitch McConnell called him a smart, level-headed, proven leader. He is currently chairman of the Bennett Group with offices in Washington, D.C. and Salt Lake City, Utah. He is also a senior advisor for Aaron Fox, who works with a wide range of international clients. He also serves as a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center, a member of the Board of Trustees of the German Marshall Fund, honorary U.S. President of Transatlantic Policy Network, and as resident scholar at the University of Utah's Hinckley Institute of Politics, where he lectures part-time. I would now like to tell you a little about Dan Glickman that perhaps you do not know. Dan Glickman is Vice President of the Aspen Institute and Executive Director of the Aspen Institute Congressional Program, which is a nonpartisan public policy, education, and civility building program for members of the United States Congress. He is also a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C. He served as the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture from March 1995 until January of 2001. And before his appointment as Secretary of Agriculture, Mr. Glickman served for 18 years in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing the 4th Congressional District of Kansas. During that time, he was a member of the House Agriculture Committee, the House Judiciary Committee, chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and was a leading congressional expert on general aviation policy. He also served as the chairman of the Motion Picture Association of America from 2004 into 2010. Before his election to Congress, in 1976, he served as president of the Wichita, Kansas School Board. You got to start somewhere. Was a partner in the law firm of Sargent, Kalinda, and Glickman, and worked as a trial lawyer for the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. He's also on the board of directors of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange Communities in Schools, chairman of the Food Research and Action Committee, a domestic anti-hunger organization, member of the National 4-H Council. He also chairs AGREE, an initiative of 8 foundations administered by the Meridian Institute, a look at long-term implications of food and agricultural policy. We had a program last week about hunger, and there's programs all over the United States about hunger policy and agriculture, and how they're related and how they are important to our economy and to people eating. He is also on the International Advisory Board of APCO, and he was recently appointed by Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack as chair of the newly created Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research. It is our pleasure this evening to present these 2 distinguished guests to you, and I will turn this program over to Bill Lacey, Director of the Dole Institute of Politics. But before I do that, please give us a warm round of applause for our guests. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Thanks to all of you for being here. And gentlemen, thanks and welcome to the Dole Institute. We're delighted to have both of you here. I think Secretary Glickman has been dispatched with a special message for us tonight. So if you'd like to start with that, we'll do that. Sure. And then get right into the program.
Okay, well, our mutual and very special friend Bob Dole would have liked to have been here. He's only been back to Kansas, I think, 40 times in the last 3 years, going to every county multiple times. But at 91, he's truly amazing, so he sent this message to be read. Thanks to everyone for attending tonight's important event and for watching our webcast. With less than 2 weeks to go until the midterm elections, my friends Dan Glickman and Bob Bennett will discuss a critically important topic tonight, America's deeply polarized political system, how we can make our government work more effectively again, and how you, the voters, can make a difference. There is not much bipartisanship, compromise, or even working together in Congress these days, and that must change. The Bipartisan Policy Center is trying to help bridge that partisan divide through its Commission on Political Reform. If you have a chance, please visit the BPC's website to learn how you can engage in the political process. That is bipartisanpolicy.org. And to make sure your voice and your ideas are heard. And don't forget to vote on November 4th. Thanks, Bob Dole. All right.
Okay, gentlemen, let's start with, and I'm not going to direct the question, but I'd ask both of you to comment on. Talk a little bit about the Commission on Political Reform, its purpose and its goals.
Well, you chaired it, so you start.
Well, I'm one of the chairs. So
That's the point,
yeah.
because there are always a Republican and a
So
Democratic chair.
just tell you who the chairs are. There's Trent Lott, the former Senate Majority Leader, Tom Daschle, the former Senate Majority Leader, Olympia Snowe, former Senator from Maine, Dirk Kempthorne, former Senator from Idaho and Governor of Idaho, and myself. And the idea was to put together a group of about 35 citizens from around the country in different walks of life, political, non-political, youth organizations, ex-military, NGOs, corporate world, to see if we could come up with a group of suggestions, recommendations that would try to help make our government work better. So to summarize, a lot of the recommendations related to the operation of Congress. For example, they dealt with trying to minimize, in some degree, the filibuster rule, trying to get people, the Congress, to work full-time, like 5 days a week, like most of us work 5 days a week, trying to get regular order into the political process so that the bills can flow the way that they should, and giving members the opportunity to debate them fully, giving the minority the appropriate rights to do that. So one segment had to do with Congress and making it work better. And there are a lot of recommendations, and you can find this online if you look at the report. The second set of recommendations had to do with elections and politics, how to encourage more voting in primaries. Right now, primary vote is about 14%. In many elections are decided in the primaries, because especially congressional districts tend to be more homogeneous. So 14% of the people are deciding who's going to be the next congressman or the next elected official elsewhere. How to increase voting turnout, how to encourage and make access to voting easier for people. So how to deal with redistricting processes to make sure that redistricting was more neutral rather than the politicians choosing their voters, which we have now, having the voters choose the politicians. And because that would tend to make more districts, again, perhaps more politically neutral. And then the final set of recommendations had to do with public service. The belief was that a disengaged American electorate, a disengaged American population, is a surefire way to encourage people to disconnect from politics. So one of the things we recommended was voluntary but encouraged service for all people between the ages of 18 and 28 to go either into the military or non-military for 1 year of their lives, under the theory that if you serve your country in some capacity, you'll become a better citizen and you'll work together. We didn't make it mandatory. There were some folks that wanted to do that. We thought that probably wouldn't fly, but we talked about civic education and a whole list of ways that we can encourage the population to be more engaged in the political system. So that's, in summary, what it was about. And as I said, you can see it online, bipartisanpolicy.org. There's a list of about 65 recommendations there. And we had strong debates. For example, one of the debates was money in politics, and some of us really wanted to limit money in politics. Some of us didn't want to limit money in politics. And so what we basically came down, the main recommendation is all political contributions should be fully disclosed, including those from these super secret organizations. That at least transparency was one thing that we could get the left and the right to agree on.
Yeah, that was an interesting thing, because folks on the left were outraged that the people on the right weren't disclosing. And then when we said, okay, how about you? Oh, well, we are public interest, so we don't need to disclose our contributors. And it was an interesting debate to finally get both sides to say, okay, if we really do believe in transparency and disclosing, everybody has to do it, including the Sierra Club, as well as the folks on the far right. And if we could get that done, I think that would make a lot of difference. Let me give you a practical example of that in a political setting, but it demonstrates the power of it. There's a group in Utah, for a variety of reasons, decided they didn't like Orrin Hatch, and they were going to go after him in one of his re-elections. And they approached the president of the Utah State Senate and said, will you run for Orrin's seat? Will you run? These are all Republicans, you know, we don't allow Democrats in Utah. And he said, okay, I'll oppose Orrin. I'll file and run against him in the primary, if you'll guarantee me the money. I'm not going to raise the money myself. Oh, we'll raise you the money. Absolutely, absolutely. You'll have all the money you need. And he said, okay. You understand, of course, that as soon as you make a contribution to me, it goes on the FEC report, and Orrin Hatch will see it. He will see your name. Oh. Well, isn't there some way, you know, state law isn't like that. Isn't there some way I can make a contribution? No. Fortunately, in federal law, at least at that level, there is full disclosure. So you have to be ready for the phone call you will get from Senator Hatch saying, why did you make this contribution? Explain to me what. He never ran. They never raised the money. That alone scared them off. I think if we had the kind of transparency that we need, a lot of people who love the anonymity of the internet and love blogs under strange names and love to write a check to a group that's the Americans for something really good, suddenly their name is there. Okay, maybe I'd better be a little more circumspect in what I'm doing.
I want to get into the recommendations in a bit more detail in just in a minute, but I'd like to get the two of you to talk a little bit about how things were different when you were spending time in Washington, D.C., and why you think it's, I would guess you would think it's worse than when you were there, and why that is the case.
Well, yeah, it's a lot worse. And the fact that I'm not there is not one of the reasons why it's a lot worse. But I learned, I hadn't really understood that. I thought I knew the Senate pretty well because I had worked with my father in the time he was there, ran his last two campaigns and served on his staff. That was legal in those days. They didn't assume automatic nepotism was corrupt. They assumed that maybe if the senator wanted his son to serve as his chief of staff, his son knew something, so I did. I thought I knew the Senate fairly well. When I got there, it dawned on me there was something I had missed. The Senate has rules, but the Senate has precedents, and the precedents trump the rules. Somebody says, let's do this, and the Senate Majority Leader, Senator Dole, stares him down and says, we don't do it that way here. Now, it's permitted under the rule, but we just don't do it that way here. I've seen Dole do that time and again to young whippersnappers that come over from the House. Did you have one of those from Kansas at one point? Never mind. I've seen Dole do that as they come over and say, well, let's do this, let's enforce this. And Dole would say, no, we don't do it that way. Gradually, in the last 10 years, people have broken the precedents, and now we do it that way because the rules allow it. All of this fuss about filibusters. When I got to the Senate, you didn't filibuster anything unless it was really, really, really important. I'm saying, I'm going to filibuster. No, you're not. We're not going to help you. No, you're not. We don't do that. It isn't worth a filibuster. Now, every single bill that has any degree of controversy connected with it requires 60 votes to pass automatically. And for all Harry Reid's complaining about the Republicans requiring 60 votes, Harry Reid did it when he was the whip for the Democrats. They broke the precedent. If we can get back to the atmosphere of, we're all here to get along, and we have precedents that we follow that keep that, that will change. I don't think you can reestablish precedents of that kind. I think you do have to change the rules. And that's going to be hard, but I think there is enough demand among the older senators, and by older I mean in terms of service rather than age, to get back to the kind of institution that it once was, that pressure to change the rules and make them conform with the old precedents will probably be there.
I would make a couple comments. Number one, our system of government was meant to not work very well at all. All right, so let's look at it. We have separation of powers. So the system was designed to decentralize powers. So in a parliamentary system, your prime minister is a head, your chief of state's also the majority leader of his own party. So we've designed a system to have be 1 foot on the brake and 1 foot on the accelerator at all time. Just that's the way it is. Imagine yourself in a car with 1 foot on the brake and 1 foot on the accelerator. That's American democracy, because they didn't want power centralized anywhere. So we create separate Congress and president equal. By the way, the founding fathers wanted the Congress, in my judgment, slightly more equal than the president because they made it Article 1. They didn't want the president as Article 1. And then they decided that the House and the Senate should be split into two because they thought there would be tyranny of the legislative body. So the whole system is kind of meant to be slow and just torturous to get things done. Anyway, so to work, it requires trust and civility and relationships and precedent and getting along. And the Senate's much worse because you have 100 equals. So every senator has got immense power. And many presidents have said any one senator is much more powerful than I am because they can stop my world overnight. The House isn't quite like that. The House is much more raucous and much more leadership oriented. So the fact of the matter is the system wasn't meant to work very well anyway. But when you have a situation where you don't work 5 days a week, you might work 1 or 2 days a week, people don't know each other anymore because they're not working 5 days a week. Most members of Congress don't move their families to Washington anymore, in part because the people at home don't like Washington. So they don't want the people to go to Washington, but that's where the job is. Got to be there. Got to learn. You got to know the people. You got to be around them. You got to trust them. You got to build relationships. So one of my closest friends in the House was Dan Quayle, a Republican, became Vice President of the United States. He was in my class. So those things make it very difficult. 2 other quick factors. One is money. So I'm sure the senator has the same stories to tell. I ran for Congress in 1976, defeated an incumbent congressman, spent $100,000 total, primary and general. Today, I'd probably spend $250,000 a week. That race would cost $5 to $7 million today. It costs $100,000. So what does that mean? It means all you do is raise money. You spend your time raising money. It means you can't spend as much time legislating and working, and then the media has obviously changed much more than it was before, and it's much more polarizing. And so all these factors, and they really accelerated. When I first came to the House in '76, they were there, but they didn't kind of permutate up to where they are now. And now it's just like a maelstrom, and it's difficult. So there are solutions. We've talked about some of the solutions. And one other thing I would tell you, that's the role of the president. So my experience is when you have strong presidents, a president can really kind of grease the wheels a little bit. And we've had some strong presidents. President Reagan, President Clinton were strong presidents during my time period. And President Bush the First, I thought, was an effective president for the most part. I think President Obama is a good man. I don't think he has got the same skill in working with the legislative branch that other presidents have. And it makes it tough because Congress needs a good leader on top to be pushing them in the process. So it's not just the Congress. You've got to look at the whole government of the United States when you look at these things.
Okay, let's talk in a little bit more detail, if I can get both of you to do so, about the reforms. And Mr. Secretary, you alluded to some of these, mentioned some of them briefly, but I'd like the two of you to comment a little bit more about electoral reform, specifically redistricting and voter access.
Well, one of the interesting things we've found at the Bipartisan Policy Center, we don't just automatically try to balance things, we try to do research too and be a think tank, is that redistricting will not produce as mixed a bag of members of the House as we thought before we got into it, because the American people seem to be sorting themselves out on their own. People move to places for a variety of reasons and end up turning a particular congressional district either into a Democratic district or a Republican district without having to have the people draw the lines to make sure that it is. Now, there are some absolutely outrageous examples of gerrymandering that have to change. The one I like, there's a group of voters here and a group of voters there, and then a very, very thin line between them, and it was described, the fellow said, if you drove down that line with your doors open, you'd hit half the voters in the district. Yeah, they need to be contiguous and have some kind of economic or cultural cohesion so that the representative really does represent something that makes sense. But what was the figure Jason used in his conversation with you when we were talking about his book, that the number of congressional districts that would be changed as a result of redistricting reform would be surprisingly modest? I don't have the number stuck in my mind.
I think that you only have probably today maybe 40 or 50 genuinely competitive congressional districts. Maybe that's too high, so that's less than 15%. Most districts have been designed either through housing patterns or through redistricting by the politicians to be single-party districts, so that all the elections are in the primaries and not in the general. Of course, you faced that in a state that wasn't redistricted because of the whole state.
Yeah, but the working on the gerrymander thing, having made that opening caveat that it's not going to be as dramatic as a lot of people think, it's still worth doing.
And they've done it in California, and they're doing it in Iowa and a few other places. You know, Kansas is an interesting state because we're a relatively homogeneous state here overall. And so it's, in congressional districts, it's frankly hard to carve a district that's overly partisan. I would say that when I was in Congress, the 4th Congressional District was pretty balanced. And in fact, Carter got 48.5% of the vote in my district in '76. I always won my district. Casabom and Dole always won the district. But it became more Republican as time went on, and that's been true of the whole state, that it became more Republican. Now, I don't, you know, so we have 4 Republican congressmen, and when I was growing up in the business, there was 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans largely in this state. I don't think if I went back to my district now, I could get 100 votes in my district. I'm not sure that I would vote for myself, but anyway, it's just the state over the last 30 years, 20 years, has become more Republican and more conservative. Now, this election coming up may test that because of the voters aren't stuck forever historically. People change. People vote for leaders that they like. They look at their records. They look at the economic records and everything else. And it may be the 3rd Congressional District, which is you're part of here, I guess. I don't know if the city of Lawrence is in the 2nd district or the 3rd district. You're in the 2nd district. But the 3rd district has always been historically viewed as, quote, the most moderate district in the state. And that hasn't changed fundamentally. And it's elected Democrats. as well as Republicans over the years. So, I mean, frankly, I think it's healthier in this is my own view, and this is not a partisan view. I don't think it's healthy to have a one-party state. You know, I think that, first of all, I think that you do better in the legislative process when you have people of both parties in your state. And I also think that it makes your politics less vigorous when it's one party as opposed to two-party. And redistricting can help in that process, although in Kansas, I'm not sure that would help all that much.
Well, Utah is considered a one-party state, but I love the statement made by the Utah state chairman, Republican state chairman, when somebody said, you know, you have a one-party state. He said, no, we don't. We have a three-party state, and I preside over two of them.
Well, that's true in Kansas, too, to some degree. That's,
if you do not have careful balance between the two parties, and one party does become dominant, then you see ideological splits develop within that party that become unhealable. I get a lot more understanding out of Democrats who disagree with me than I do out of the Republicans who call me a rhino. Now, my reaction to them is, look, my first vote was for Eisenhower. I voted all Republican all the rest of my life. I was with Ronald Reagan for NAFTA, which you weren't. All of the rest of that. You are the Republican in name only, and I am the real article.
Yeah.
But you get into those kinds of ridiculous fights, and the other thing that comes along, and I always said, except in the state of Utah, but now I have to bite my tongue. The other thing that always comes along in a truly one-party state, where you never have a Democratic governor, like Dan Glickman, or a Republican governor, like Mitt Romney, to take a red and a blue state, is corruption. If there is no counterbalancing coming from a viable party on the other side, corruption creeps into the dominant party at some point. And for all of our self-congratulations in Utah that we do not have corruption, well, the hot topic right now is that 2 successive attorneys general are now on trial for selling fire insurance all across the state. That is, we will look the other way on your corruption, on your illegal activities in your industries, if you will make the following contributions, and we'll give you the amounts and the places to send it.
I hope the Democrats don't make a 30-second ad out of his comments just
Oh,
now.
you know, it's no secret that they have been indicted.
You know, I will have to say it was Jimmy Carter. I mean, it was Bill Clinton who did NAFTA. That was.
But it was Ronald Reagan's idea.
Okay, all right. So you see, there's bipartisanship.
Yeah.
You know?
Right. That's a very good example of finding common ground, gentlemen. Yeah. So, talk a little bit about getting more people to participate in the voting process, because I know you did a little bit of work on that too.
Well, you know, I mean, look, the trends are pretty flat in terms of Americans voting. I think it's about 54-55% in presidential elections. The real problem is the very, very low voter turnout in primaries. It's just we're electing people all over this country with 15% of the people voting. Yeah. And so if you wanted me to pinpoint where there's a real significant problem, and one of the things we suggest is we have a national primary day in this country where all federal primaries will occur on the same day. Now, that will take a lot of legislation, you know, and I'm not saying it would happen overnight, but somehow you have to highlight that, you know, in this process. The second thing that worries me about voter turnout, you know, some states, like Kansas, to be honest with you, and others, in my judgment, are going the wrong direction in terms of making it more difficult for people to vote. We ought to be really going the other direction. And I'm not unconcerned about fraud. There's just very, very little voter fraud in this country. It does exist places, but it's a problem that can be dealt with without restricting people's access to the polls. And I think it discourages some people. But the real problem with voter turnout is, in my judgment, people do not see their government and their country producing solutions to problems. You know, whether it's roads and sewers and water systems and bridges, or whether it's science and health research and the other kinds of things that a country does. And then when government makes mistakes, like it sometimes does, the way the Obamacare rollout took place, or the VA hospital, or IRS, or the Secret Service, or Katrina, or all sorts of things, people start saying, and the politicians egg this on, government just can't work. It just doesn't work. And when you hear that message over and over again, the reaction is to tune out, and for a lot of people will go into humanitarian or public service activities that are not in government. They'll go work for volunteer organizations, which is great. But that won't solve the problems of scale. It still takes government to solve the big problems of scale, of building highways and sewers and airports and water systems and all education, all this other kind of stuff. And so that's why this is a fundamental problem. We can do some things, I think, like make it easier to vote and encourage primary voting, but ultimately we got to start looking like our country can produce successful results as a country, legislatively and an executive branch. And I think that will then inspire people to go back in. I'll tell you one thing. I'm not sure what your age is, but how close we are.
I'm 81.
Okay, well, you look damn good for 81. Is all I can say. But I'm going to be 70 next month, and I was right in the middle of the draft era, and I guarantee you that was a pretty powerful incentive to participate in the American political system. And one of the thoughts I had for a long time, we're not going to do this. I'm not calling for a institution of the draft, but when everybody has a stake in the game, they're a lot more likely to vote when they're kind of disconnected from what happens in the political system.
The media is a major part of this problem because the media assumes that if you're in government, you're corrupt or stupid or both. I love the comment quoted by a woman from New Hampshire. They talked to her about her vote. She said, "I never vote. It only encourages them." And let me give you an example. Ebola. Right now, Ebola is a major issue that may well determine the outcome of some of the Senate races. And it's being portrayed in the media as yet another example of the incompetence of the Obama administration. And the cry out of my party is, let's have a travel ban. Let's prevent any flights into the United States from the countries in Africa where the Ebola is. Oh, wait. There are no such flights now. There are no airlines that fly from Liberia to the United States. If you're going to get there from here, you have to go through Europe or someplace else. So are we going to... When the president said the travel ban is probably not a good idea, he was right. Isn't that a terrible thing to have to admit? Particularly for those of you who are Republicans, that President Obama can be right. And the media has picked this up, and they're scaring everybody to death. And, exposure to Ebola, it'll be like the flu. No, it isn't. Talk to a scientist. This fellow who came into America who died. And then the nurse who treated him got, panic. Are you aware that in addition to his exposure to the nurse, he had a whole group of members of his family whom he met and dealt with and interacted with before he went to the hospital, all of whom have been in quarantine for 21 days and all of whom have come out of quarantine without Ebola. The nurse was sticking needles in him. The nurse was doing all kinds of things, and there was the protocols in the hospital as to the way she should handle that caused her to get it, not because she was in the same room with him or on the same airplane with him or walked down the hall while he was at the other end. But the way the media is portraying this, it's making the president look bad. It may turn into a political issue. It'll get a lot of airtime. And it's the wrong thing to do. We should do what, I don't know how, in these days when the media is so fragmented and itself so divided along ideological lines. I mean, the New York Times is just as predictable as Rush Limbaugh. I don't read their editorials except every once in a while just to reaffirm that that is still the case. And every time I read the editorial, it reaffirms that is still the case. I can ignore them for another 6 months and not miss a thing. You know, and I never listen to Limbaugh for exactly the same reason.
As opposed to the Lawrence Journal World, right?
Whenever it's delivered to me, I read it carefully.
But you know, one interesting point you raise, I agree with you on Ebola, and the last 20 years, the vitriol against a president is just extraordinary. I mean, you almost feel that the hatred of Obama among certain circles is just so great that it's become irrational, and it's very worrisome. And the same thing, not quite as bad, but almost the Democrats did to Bush. I'll have to tell you. I wrote this piece about Bush. He did this PEPFAR and the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and the Bush administration was responsible for saving hundreds of thousands of lives in Africa on AIDS, HIV, malaria, TB, and everything.
Probably millions.
I wrote this piece, and I got attacked. You know, why am I reinforcing the good work that George Bush did? But it wasn't quite as bad, but it was pretty bad. You know, the language that we use in politics, the language against the president, the language against each other. I watched some of the ads today, this afternoon. I was staying at the Oriad Hotel, and I had the TV on, and they're the same ads I see in Washington. By the way, you just put a face in, take a face out, put a face in, and it's the exact same ads. I think people would feel that maybe they weren't getting for all the money that politics costs, they were not getting very much individual attention in these advertising. But the fact of the matter is that one of the things we've got to figure out a way, we do at the Bipartisan Policy Center, in addition to these specific reforms bills that you talked about, is how to get the languaging and the rhetoric in this country to be somewhat more respectful of people in the political world. Both sides play this game equally. And it's disgraceful, and what it does is it makes people believe, as you just said, that politicians are incompetent, corrupt, or stupid, and there is no reason to participate in the political system when we do that. And that's tragic, and that trend has to really stop.
I remember a bumper sticker back in '92 when I ran that said every politician should serve 2 terms, 1 in Congress and 1 in jail.
I want to make sure I save time for... Go ahead and laugh a few more minutes. I want to make sure I save time for Q&A, but I got about 3 more questions I'd like to get through. Can both of you talk a little bit about the Commission's recommendations on service?
There's a lot of interest in national service. And General Stanley McChrystal, you know, he was the head of our forces in Afghanistan. He's now created a national commission on service, and he believes that every young American should serve in some capacity. And we've adopted those proposals here. And, you know, and service can be, again, charitable, humanitarian, military, a whole variety of ways. And then you shouldn't just serve without either getting something for it. So some form of compensation, some sort of benefit, like a veteran's benefit or a benefit to get you some skills for college purposes or whatever else it is. You know, you hear people like Bob Dole and Tom Brokaw and others talk about the greatest generation, and I didn't serve in the armed forces, but I talked to people who were in my generation who did, and they said 2 things happened. They hated every minute of it, and it changed their lives for the positive, because they were required to be with people who were different than they were. They didn't come from the same town, the same place, the same racial group, the same background, and they learned something called cooperation. And so that's the whole idea behind the service thing. And there is a lot of good service opportunities. There's AmeriCorps, Teach for America. There are a lot of good things happening, but it's not regularized. And most young people don't do it. So I think that's the idea behind it.
Yeah, I did go through basic training and had exactly the experience you described, with people from all over the country thrown together into a situation where we all hated it. But in addition to the experience you've described of getting to know other people, I realized that there was a common experience that virtually every young American male had. Every young American male knew what it was like to be yelled at by a drill sergeant. Every young American male, I've never owned a gun. I have no interest in guns, but I am a certified sharpshooter with an M1 rifle because of going through basic training at Fort Ord, and that is an experience I shared with everybody in my generation. And it helped knit us together with a common experience as Americans. We do not have that kind of experience today. And I met kids from the inner city who had never been outside of city walls. And they looked around at the wide open spaces of the West and what is all this? This kind of common experience would be a very valuable thing for our generation to have for at least 6 months, just to get them away from their iPads for that long.
What reaction have the commission's recommendations received?
Well, I was in the group that went to see Lamar Alexander, and I found it fascinating. The BPC staff said, here are our recommendations, and they took it to Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, and Mitch said, I'm sorry, I'm so swamped. Will you please take it to Lamar? And I will pay attention. You know, I kind of delegate those sorts of things because I'm heavily involved, given his campaign and his duties in the Senate and all the rest of it. So the staff called me and said, will you come with us? Because we know if you come, Lamar will be there. And I said, sure. And we went and we presented them to Lamar. Now, Lamar Alexander, in my view, is one of the more thoughtful members of the Senate, and one who has the kind of background you wish all your public officials had. He's been a governor, he's been president of a university, he's been a cabinet officer, and now he's a senator. There's not much you can throw at him that he doesn't understand. And he looked at him and he said, these are great. These are wonderful. And then he said, there's not a single one of them that we couldn't accomplish this afternoon if we were willing to do it within the current Senate rules. Back to my conversation about precedents. And he said, what we need is a change of leadership to move in this direction. And then made this comment, and here's a partisan. Alert, be prepared. He said, Mitch McConnell has said to the Republican conference, if I become the majority leader, I will reestablish, and he went down the list. And he said, if Mitch were the leader, we would be accomplishing a lot of this. And then, this the most interesting and, in my view, most encouraging thing, he said, when Mitch got through with that speech, we said to him, if you don't do that as majority leader, we will get a new leader. That's what it's going to take. Leadership and change from those who hold the positions that can make the difference.
There are lots of recommendations. So some, I think, are easier to get done than others. And I think the recommendations on rules, amendments, regular order, process, a lot of that can really happen if leadership wants it to happen, if the members press them on it. You know, things like universal primary dates, redistricting commissions, those are tougher. They take, those are more aspirational. We'll see what happens. One of the recommendations we adopted, it's already begun to happen, you know, we basically said the president and congressional leadership ought to meet once in a while. I mean, you'd think that would happen just as regular order. And in fact, I think if President Obama had met with a member of Congress or Senate once a week to talk about what's happening at home and how their kids are doing, that might have changed the course of America in this country. Just that little bit of knowledge. But anyway, so that's now begun to happen more regularly, the meeting with the leadership. And then we recommended the president meets with a joint, not so much a joint session of Congress, but a joint meeting with Congress twice a year. And a little bit like you see in parliamentary settings, where the president goes to Congress twice a year. It's not like a State of the Union message. It's an engagement. Okay, Mr. President, what do you think about this? What should we do on this?
Question time in the House of Parliament,
you know,
yeah.
And something along those lines. And I get a sense that we're going to try to press the presidential candidates who are running in 2016 to take on that as one of the things. So that may happen.
Okay, I have one final question, then we'll go to audience questions and answers. There's a lot of students here tonight. They're obviously very concerned about the direction of government, the hyperpartisanship. What can we do? What would the two of you say to them? What message would you share with them tonight to encourage them to stay on this path, and what else can they do to help with your recommendations and your concepts?
Well, the obvious: get involved, stay involved, pick a side. I know it's nice to say, oh, no labels, parties matter. Pick one, and then get in it, and then do everything you can to make sure that it stays on track in the direction that you think it ought to go. But understand this, as you do this as young people and as you mature in your political activity. American politics are unique. Dan Glickman made that clear in his opening comment. One of the things that's happening is that we are moving away from that unique position. That is, American politics are structured to represent people. European politics are structured to represent ideology. If you're a member of the Tory party in Great Britain and you stray in any way from the orthodoxy of the Tory manifesto, you are not a member of Parliament the next time it meets. The Prime Minister has the right to remove you and see to it that you do not get nominated as an MP from your constituency anymore. I had a conversation with the British ambassador, and we was talking about American politics, and I was trying to explain, how you deal with leadership and the party, and I said, now, of course, the one excuse that you always can give and get away with for voting against leadership is by saying, I have to vote this way for my state. And he said, that's because you live in a representative democracy and we do not. You can't do that. We are getting away from that, as you are seeing more and more people saying, I have to be loyal to my ideology. And to pick on the most dominant examples of that right now, I have to be loyal and true to Tea Party ideology, whether it's good for my state or not. So, to you young people, pick whatever ideology you want, but recognize that American politics says, if you're the congressman from the 4th District in Kansas, you do what's good for the 4th District in Kansas. Even if your leader, the speaker, leans on you to say, no, you got to vote with me ideologically this way. And we need to be in the position where I can say, I'm sorry, but Mitch, I cannot be with you on this because I represent the state of Utah, and this is why, coming from Utah with Utah values and Utah issues, and I'm voting with Utah. And traditionally, that gets you a pass every single time. That's very important to preserve in American politics because it's ultimately the clash of people who represent their districts and their states that work out the compromises and ultimately make the thing work, rather than the people who demand absolute ideological purity and end up driving us into a ditch.
I'm thinking, there's a great test right now. I mean, when I used to be in Congress, I used to say, what is Kansas noted for? Well, we have the largest ball of twine, the deepest hand-dug well, and I went through all the stuff. But we've got the most interesting politics in the country in this state right now. It's amazing. So it should be an opportunity for people to really get engaged, especially young people. And the issues are issues that ought to affect people rather dramatically. So I agree totally with Bob Bennett just said about the kind of the changing nature of our country. But right now in Kansas, I'm not saying who you should vote for or against. I'd say a couple things, though, just what you said. We're not the nonpartisan policy center. We're the bipartisan policy center. We believe healthy partisanship is good. You'll always have it because there'll be different ideologies, different of opinion. Right now, you got in Kansas politics, you probably have the clearest difference of candidates running for governor and senator than we've had for a very long time. And one of the reasons why is because you've got well-financed, serious campaigns on both sides. And so I would say that maybe this is going to be a new day in Kansas politics. I go back to the thing that we're a conservative state, but we're a pragmatic state. And I just look at this man over there who's probably been the dominant force in Kansas politics the last 40 or 50 years. And, people should strive to be like him, really. He once told me, he says, I used to talk too much. He said, he said to me, he says, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a simple reason. I sort of took that as kind of an insult. But he was very responsible for my career. I wouldn't have been Secretary of Agriculture without him. And so when President Clinton asked me to secretary, I said, well, what about Bob Dole? And he says, well, you think I would have done this without going to Dole? So I talked to Senator Dole, and he kind of in a kind of funny way said, well, maybe this will get you out of Kansas forever, in his own way,
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's like he always wanted to do ultimately what was right, big picture, what was right. He still kept his conservative views. And I think the best antidote to cynicism, especially among young people, is leaders who stand for something, who look like they're in this business for the right reasons, who don't run just because it's a comfortable thing to do, willing to take tough choices. And this is a great test model right now, the state, these elections, really in this state. You have an opportunity that most states don't have right now.
When the secretary told that story about Senator Dole, Senator Bennett said, that's Bob Dole. And I can tell you, Senator Dole's told me that story too, so I know that for a fact. So
but
we're going to go.
It didn't get me out of Kansas forever, but it did make sure I'd never run against him. That was for sure.
We're going to do Q&A. If you got a question, raise your hand. One of our students will come by, and we're going to start right here. Please, no statements, just questions.
Thank you for being here this evening. The whole matter of bipartisanship, I think, has been one of the banes of the last 30 years, should I say, almost. And it seems to me we have it represented in a very tragic way in the Congress, the way they seat the people. It seems to me that you were elected to be a representative, not a Republican or Democrat, when you walked in that hall of Congress. And that you lost that label because you were to serve the people, not only Kansas, but also of the whole nation. And that they should, instead of having the one side stand up when the president says something, the other side sits down, it seems to me we've just fostered a very unfortunate bipartisanship. Why not seat them by social security numbers, by age, by some kind of a lottery? That's the way to get things done nowadays, have a lottery.
I have sat next to Democrats at joint sessions of Congress, and it didn't rub off. We are friends or not friends, depending on a whole series of circumstances. And yeah, I think the antidote to what you're talking about, the State of the Union, if I were president and giving the State of the Union address, I would announce at the beginning, I don't want any of you to stand up for anything until I'm through. And just let everybody sit there. I think that whole thing is silly.
They actually have a buddy system. It's a buddy system in the House where you can bring a buddy from the other side of the, and sit next to that person as part of a way to demonstrate what you're talking about. I'm not sure it's had a very profound impact.
Okay, we have a member of our SAB, Chance, over here.
Do you guys feel as though like members of my generation will decrease the gridlock in Congress by the time we get there? Do you think it's sort of a cycle that will go up and down in that respect?
I don't think age will have anything to do with it. I think it will ebb and flow primarily on the basis of the issues. And the people who handle the truly great issues will respond to them either in a responsible way or not. And just because you're an idealistic young person coming into policy, I don't think that automatically would change anything one way or the other.
I concur with that.
Okay, we have a question right here.
Yeah, good evening. I wanted to thank you. I think the bipartisan blueprint is a great idea. The points are what we need to do. To me, they represent a vision of where we should be going. As a commander, you have to lead a vision. It has to be a long-term leadership. And if it's going to be bipartisan, it needs to be a leader from both sides. Who are those going to be, and how long are they going to do it? Because it takes a long time.
Well, I mean, that's why I talk about service, because you got to create almost not a religion, but a strong belief system in terms of the collaboration of the country as a whole. If people want to participate in their country, and then they go up through the reins and they get into politics and get elected, but in large part their experiences are working with each other, across party lines and regional lines and racial lines and ethnic lines and all those kinds of things. And so I do think that what we saw among this country was always a great country, but the Second World War had a profound impact on America. It changed the course of history. And I think it changed the course of history because of service. So I think long-term, service is going to be a big part of making this country resilient. Again, not the only answer. I also think there are other things. Civics education. You ever used to watch Jay Leno when he had jaywalking, and he'd ask, who's the President of the United States, and somebody would say Groucho Marx or something like that, and it was like, we thought it was ridiculous, and I don't know if it was entertainment or whether it was true or not, but it's abysmal, the knowledge of people about their system of government. And so we emphasize in education the STEM, science, technology, education, math, and I think that's a great idea. But I also think people ought to know something about their country, their government, how it works, how things get done and don't get done, and why they don't get done. And so I think there are a lot of answers to your very good question.
Well, you ask who are the leaders, where they're going to come from. I think they're going to come from inside the system. Now, it's interesting. The current situation is a mess, and we're finding some very good people deciding they want to get out. They've had enough, and they're leaving. But there are some who are staying. And I think they are the ones on both sides of the political aisle who will work at getting this thing taken. I referred to Lamar Alexander. Lamar considered stepping down. Lamar considered retiring. He doesn't need the money. He doesn't need the glory. But he has a sense of, I want to be here while we fix this. And Lamar has a number of Republican senators with him. I've singled him out. There are Democrats of the same view. This thing is a mess, but we're going to stick around. I'm speaking for the Senate now. If I'd wanted to understand the House, I would have run for it. There are Democratic senators who are saying, you know, we've lost our way for whatever reason, but we've got to work to fix this. And I'm encouraged by some of them saying to me, Bob, we are having conversations with our Republican colleagues that we could not have had 2 years ago. The atmosphere is loosening up. And these are people who understand the system, who remember what it was when it was working better, who are beginning to say, we've got to work to get back. And they will reach out to the new folks coming in and say, this is what we can do, and they will begin to rebuild it. You say, well, that's Pollyanna. Yeah, I'm a Pollyanna guy. America has come through worse than this. I remember in my campaign, you know, that the main problem I had in my campaign was that I was the incumbent. I remember sitting down with a fellow. We went through all of the things that I had done, including a number of things that I had done for him personally. And at the end, I was saying, okay, now are you ready to vote for me? And he said, Senator, I want to send Washington a message. And how does voting you back in office send that message? And that's the way it was back in 2010. Okay.
Did you ever talk to that guy again?
Oh, sure. I mean, why not? One woman came up to me and said, this is the worst time our country has ever been in. She was literally trembling. And I use literally the way the word it really means, not the way Joe Biden uses it. She was literally trembling and said, this is the worst time our country has ever had. And I said to her, oh, would you have liked to live during the Civil War? Well, how about World War II? There was no guarantee we were going to win World War II. It was nothing automatic or inevitable about that. If Franklin Roosevelt had not probably broken the law in supporting Winston Churchill, Hitler would have taken over Europe. If we had not given Stalin the material we gave prior to the siege at Stalingrad, Hitler would have conquered Russia. There were no guarantees. America came through that, and by comparison, this is not anywhere near as bad. And when people say, yeah, but it's the worst political atmosphere we've had in our lifetimes. And I said, not my lifetime. I remember Vietnam. I remember when the President of the United States could not travel anywhere outside of the United States, outside of Washington, D.C., except to a military base. Because the animosity to him was so great that his simply appearing somewhere in any town in the United States would immediately produce an angry demonstration of people shouting, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids have you killed today? We are not at that level of animosity and difficulty. We can get through this.
I would say we're not at that level of animosity, but the disrespect that some people have in their institutions is profound.
Yes,
and I hear it on talk radio. I hear the way people talk about the other side, and it's sickening because a country can't survive without this. I'll tell you one quick story. I spent 6.5 years in the motion picture business. So if you think politics is cruel, try that. You know, the egos in that business dwarf the egos in Washington. But one studio executive told me, he says, there's one difference between a successful business like our studio and what you do in the United States government. And I see Mr. Farrell here, and there are a lot of people who've been in business. And he says, to do well, we have to perform as a high-performance team. We have to have teamwork, because if we don't, we're dead as a company. We have to work together. says, you people don't work together unless there's a catastrophe. Then you will come together. Well, part of that is based on the thing I talked about, separation of powers and everything else. So it's tough under the worst circumstances. And that's why it really, we can talk about Congress all we want. Mark Twain said 15 years ago, there's only one true criminal class in America, and that's Congress. So in some sense, things never change. People love to hate their Congress and congressmen, and I understand it. And I served in the executive branch too, so I can tell you the president has a big role to play in all this stuff. It's not just the Congress. The White House and the chief executive of the United States, the most powerful man on the face of the earth, has to engage in this political system as well. But I would have to finally just say, I agree with you in this context. You know, with all the misery that we go through in our political system, country is still doing reasonably well. We're a resilient country. We got these serious structural problems in our political system that we just have to work on the best we can. Otherwise we could see public distrust in America go down the tubes. We can't let that happen. And citizens have to be a part of it. So let me give you one example. Most congressmen used to have town hall meetings. I don't know if your congressman has town hall meetings anymore. You know what they do now? A lot of them have telephonic town hall meetings. They get 32,000 people on the phone and they answer 7 questions. You know, so you can't see their eyes.
Well, it's even better than that because you can know in advance what the question is going to be.
So I mean, I would demand that they have personal, on face-to-face town meetings where you can talk about these issues, where you can stand up and tell them what you think. I mean, that works. It does work, you know.
Okay,
All right,
I've
sorry.
got time for 2 more questions here. We'll go back here first.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I just have a couple of questions.
Just one, Emily. Sorry.
Yeah, based on the same thing. As you talked about, like the younger generation not having that uniting experience, such as the draft. What would an experience for my generation look like? And do you think that this lack of common experience really seriously affects the way that we think politically?
I think you need to do something outside of your safe space. Whatever that is. It could be Teach for America. It could be volunteering at some local humanitarian type of thing, feeding program. But in some degree of sacrifice in the process. Because I tell you, the way people are getting their information, plus social media, plus technology, plus iPads and all the other devices out there, it's too easy to just get immersed in yourself. And I think the whole trick is to figure out how to engage with others in some kind of public service orientation. That's my belief.
I think a place that is absolutely foreign country to most Americans is the inner city. And traveling into that world can open your eyes to a whole series of kinds of things. I won't give you any of the details, but my family has gotten involved in a situation with the comment my wife makes when we come away from that, she says, I feel like I need to get my passport stamped because I've just come from a foreign country. But it's not a foreign country at all. It's a city in America where things are going on that are so foreign to everything we have been involved with in all of our lives and in our children's lives. And we've gotten our children involved in this, and we're seeing it change their perspective of their responsibilities in their own communities to discover that these kinds of things are done. Whether it are church groups that put it together, or service clubs that put it together, or some kind of organization, and maybe it needs to be a federal government activity, but sometimes most of the time that's pretty heavy-handed. But some sort of federal incentive for people to do these kinds of things. There's an awful lot of foreign territory within the sea to shining sea that we live on, where people could get the kinds of experience that I talked about when I went through basic training.
Okay, we have time for one final question right here.
Thank you. Given the role that money plays in the campaign, in the political system, to what extent do you think, should we adopt your recommendations, the media system would reward bipartisanship to an extent that it becomes sustainable?
I don't know how in the world you reward it except at the ballot box. And until the Tea Party wave came along in 2010, I was rewarded enormously for my reaching across the aisle by the fact that the Democrats never really ran anybody against me. And some of the folks on the far right would get nervous with me, but all right, this was great. And I would see people who were more hard edge get penalized at the ballot box for that. So instead of saying, okay, here's the trip to Hawaii or whatever, if you vote across the aisle so many times, it's here's validation from the voters. And if I can take this example to close with, Bob Dole resigned from the Senate to devote full-time to his presidential campaign. The most packed I have ever seen the Senate chamber. They were spilling over the balcony, the staff had filled in every available nook and cranny, and every single senator was on the floor, and all the rest was on the day that Bob handed his resignation in and walked out of the Senate chamber, no longer a senator. He reminisced, you were there, I'm sure, listening to that. He reminisced about his career. And we all sat there and listened to him tell us what the highlights were and what the things were that stood out in his mind as a Senate career. And then watched him walk out of the Senate chamber and down the Senate steps to his car, with the Senate steps filled with people honoring him. They had to part to let him go down and get in his car. Okay, not long after that, I'm in the Senate dining room for breakfast, and there's Connie Mack, Republican senator from Florida, having breakfast with the Democrat. I can't remember who the Democrat was, it doesn't much matter. And afterwards, I commented on this to Connie, and he said, I listened to Dole. Every single one of his highlights involved some kind of cooperation, some kind of deal, some kind of arrangement with the Democrat. And I decided that if I was going to have a career as distinguished as Bob Dole's career, I better start going across the aisle and talking to some people on the other side. Now, that didn't mean that Connie Mack was any less of a Republican, and it didn't mean that he was going to compromise his principles when he made the deal, because Dole never did. But it did mean that he wanted to get a reward, to use your term, maybe not in electoral terms, but in terms of what it would mean to his character and his reflection on his own career when it was over. I look back on my career now, and there are votes that I regret, and most of them are votes that I cast for purely partisan purposes in order to try to hang on to my seat. And the votes that I'm the proudest of are the votes that I cast without regard to that, and many times in cooperation with Democrats. So the reward comes from the voters, and the reward comes from the careers that are formed, rather than any kind of artificial sort of, gee, we'll create this sort of prize you can win if you just hit the bipartisan bell 72 times in 22 minutes or whatever goes into the contest.
First of all, I couldn't say it better than Bennett just did. I'd just add 2 points, though. One is, young people have the opportunity that we never have. You've got these little things here. They're very empowering. I'm telling you, it's not just a plaything. The world comes to you through these things. And so we've got to figure out a way that you can use these as an empowering device to engage the political system. Because you don't have to be rich or the Koch brothers or a left-wing Koch brother to be involved in politics anymore. You can be. I've seen it happen over and over again, and and people do listen because this gives you numbers and power. One other thing I want to say, I read the Wichita Eagle online, and sometimes I read the Capital Journal online, and I do read the New York Times editorials, and I like them more than I dislike them, but I guess we could disagree on that kind of thing. And I read the Kansas City Star. I think they've done a very good job of covering these campaigns. Newspapers have an ability to give you the texture of politics much better than the electronic media does. And the decline of newspapers has had a lot to do with the lack of good coverage of politics. And I don't know what to do about it because I don't think TV does a very good job. And where they do it, it tends to give fairly short shrift and it doesn't drill down into the issues very carefully and thoughtfully. In these elections, especially in the governor's election, I'm telling you, newspapers have done a darn good job of looking at what the issues are, and I think it's been really helpful. And the media, I don't blame the media. You know, we have different media than we used to have. We get the media that really the public likes. Public likes entertainment, and so the media has become more of an entertainment model than a news model. But one of the things we could try to do in this country is try to develop a greater attachment to the written word and to encourage investigative journalism, good, thoughtful, responsible investigative journalism. It is one place where people can have access to the world in a much better place. And again, I applaud what I see in Kansas because I think it's actually been pretty good this election cycle.
Gentlemen, thank you for an extraordinary discussion tonight. It's great for me to see both of you again. I haven't seen Senator Bennett in almost 20 years. So, sir, it's a real honor to have you here. And Secretary Glickman, you're welcome anytime as well. So thank you all for coming out tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. And we'll see you hopefully Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m.